Epistle 3 was ex-Valve writer Marc Laidlaw's image of a conclusion to the Half-Life episodic format, in what felt like such a significant, huge thing back then for us fans. Now, 7 years on, where are we? That's what I'll be getting into today. Oh, and look out for the Marc Laidlaw email iceberg, an absolute gargantua of a video.
These things, they take time.
I was 17 years old when Epistle 3 came out, and I uploaded my own reading of it. This was at a time before my viewers changed my life forever. And hey, I cannot overstate my gratitude here. It's free to subscribe, so go on, treat yourself. The air felt so different, so much more optimistic. None of us had any idea what the future would hold, for our lives or for the series. But on this day, we sat together and we shared the moment. As a creator in this space, that will always be one of my fondest memories, next to the passionate gamers Alex reaction. But all of us had the same question: why did Marc Laidlaw just randomly drop Epistle 3? Well, of course I know why, and if you keep watching, so will you. People had their theories. Some thought this was canon, others thought not. I personally welcomed it, but I immediately knew that if anything substantial happened at Valve, it would, explicitly or otherwise, be tossed aside. Epistle 3 was my halfway house between childish Half-Life 3 confirmed optimism and debased and black suppository doomerism about the series. A feeling largely reflective of my life at the time, coming of age, and a sentiment that was shared by a lot of the newer fans. All this to say, Epistle 3 took on something of an allegorical character. A neat little tall tale that you could take or leave. What people really saw in it was a reflection of themselves. Some of you guys are way too optimistic. But in the time between then and now, something substantial, possibly a couple of things, maybe even 3, happened at Valve, or are happening, and Epistle 3 was immediately tossed aside, as it would have to be. And obviously, they're not going to be making Epistle 3 into a game. Not only would that be repetitive, but it seems literally no one on Earth is capable of such a task. As if Gaben himself has put a hex on the very concept. As some of you may know, Mr. Laidlaw came out and basically said he wanted to distance himself from all of it, that it fundamentally was a mistake. So what, if anything, really pushed him to make such a big choice? Why take an action that would affect his colleagues, his legacy, and possibly even his mental health? Fortunately for us, there's plenty of info out there to read, and since we all hate reading, I did it just for you. And with this information out there, my thoughts are simple. I started to believe that Epistle 3 was more about Marc Laidlaw himself than anything the fandom was necessarily looking for. Now, I do not mean this in a cruel way. Mr. Laidlaw has given us our cherished series. He's a wonderful writer with an unmistakably intricate way of putting even simple thoughts across, with great emotion. This emotion is instantly recognizable in Epistle 3, especially at the end. He's more than entitled to these feelings. But let me just swap out a couple words in the final paragraph here so you can see it. And here we are. I spoke of my return to this shore. It's been a circuitous path to lands I once knew. And surprising to see how much the industry has changed. Enough time has passed that few remember me, or what I was saying when I last spoke, or what precisely we hoped to accomplish. At this point, the series will have failed or succeeded. No thanks to me. Old friends have moved on to new ideas, or have left the company. I no longer know or recognize most members of the development team, though I believe the spirit of the series still persists. I expect you know better than I the appropriate course of action, and I leave you to it. Expect no further correspondence from me regarding these matters. This is my final episode. To get into Laidlaw's headspace, even just 5% of what he must have been feeling, I'm going to ask you guys to remember how you felt about the series, and about Epistle 3, and imagine this was your livelihood, what put you on the screen. We've all made this journey through time together. You and I. We've laughed, we've cried, and we've basically etched out a decades-old culture of our own, as Valve fans, here in the screaming void of the so-called WWW. Now, like Mark, like you, I'm transformed. Rather than my thoughts being consumed by tidbits about Breen Grub and Zombine voice lines, I'm thinking about my work, marriage, family. The 2017 Mercedes-Benz W205 C300 Coupe. Marc Laidlaw once had to write so much of what we love in Half-Life, an extremely special time that will likely overshadow his other works, as fantastic as they are. You do not get to choose what you're remembered for. Your magnum opus is most definitely not what you think it is, or even what you really want it to be. Sometimes Pyrocynical releases his take on a game just days before you finish yours. 3 times. Fancy that, Niall. I know you're watching this. I saw you at the
Address withheld.
again, and I was totally going to call you out, but you were with those two strange masked men again, so I didn't. Not having control as a creator, you just have to make peace with that. And this was most likely one of Marc's ways of doing this. A man who is now in his mid-60s, and, like it or not, appears to be ruminating on his legacy and mortality in the most Lovecraftian terms. He still has nightmares about that cat. Does this sound far-fetched? Well, consider this. If you're not convinced by the gripping, emotional writing of Mr. Laidlaw, Epistle 3 would suck as a game, and people were saying this even when it was freshly released. This is in no way the same thing as, say, Half-Life 2's story. It's effectively a quarter of a product. To achieve the heights of ludonarrative harmony that we players have enjoyed for so long, Valve's gameplay is inexorably tied to their stories. To steal from the later, more substantial parts of this video, a quote from Laidlaw says, "It's important to say that every story we did was a thing we discovered along the way as a team, and not as something I had an idea for, and somehow drove people to execute. The only way to figure out the story for a Half-Life game was to make the game. There's no reason to think a thing I put down on paper was going to bear any relation to a final product." So when he released Epistle 3, what we got was, quote, not Episode 3 at all. You can't just write a Half-Life story. You have to incubate it. It grows with the team, with the years, with the technology. Every mistake, every small victory, and every element contributes to the inkwell. But enough inference. You want to hear everything the Laidlaw has to say, don't you? Very well. Enter! In an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun, a lot of the community's theories as to the true nature and feelings around Epistle 3 were proven right. A lot were proven wrong, surprising absolutely nobody. And though I can't take credit for being absolutely right about everything thus far all by myself, I want the record to show that I have indeed been right about absolutely everything thus far. Okay? Cool. Let's move on. You see, Epistle 3, as I said, was in many ways an allegory for what Laidlaw was feeling in regards to leaving Valve and everything that came before and immediately after. All this sappy talk about feelings, legacies and stuff, this is the payoff. Laidlaw admits that he wished he could have dealt with these feelings in time, and perhaps by himself, or at least behind closed doors. He wished he had not implicitly brought Valve into it. He said, "Eventually my mind would have calmed, and I'd have come out of it the other side a lot less embarrassed." And he goes on to admit that he's aware that it most likely caused trouble for his friends, something he deeply regrets. I know exactly how this feels. And I haven't even made Half-Life, just shitty content inspired by it. Can you imagine the magnitude of these feelings? But most significantly, Laidlaw confirms my original suspicions about Epistle 3, that it was truly about him. But what sort of state of mind was Marc Laidlaw truly in to do this? In this interview he said, deranged. There's really no other explanation. This was a man going through the most traumatic breakup of his life. And in a fit of admittedly misguided passion, he stood outside the damp, dusty walls of City 17 and played Triage at dawn on a boombox, lifting it above his bespectacled head, just to see us come to the window one last time, knowing we'd tell him to keep it down, even against our heart's wishes, because Dad was downstairs, and of course, Dad had his own plans too. So before I answer the big question of where are we now, I think there's a little more from Marc that deserves to be heard, which, I'm frankly amazed, confirms yet more of what I thought. He says, "What I hadn't realized is that if you stop writing books for 20 years, everyone forgets who you are." He says, if you're, say, around 60 years old, you're gonna be dead soon. So there's not much reason for publishers to start trying to build an audience. Now, of course, on the face of it, in a very hard-headed businessman's sense, this is flatly true. To a publisher, you and your work are their product. And if you're about to expire, well, maybe it's not the best business decision to pour money into you. But this is also a comprehension of his own mortality, which could be really torturous, and I'm sure it has been. But that doesn't mean he needs writing to keep going. Now he says he has music to keep himself going. I have to say it's some of the most unique stuff I've heard in a while. Please give him the love and support he deserves if you genuinely enjoy it like I do. But where are we now? Well, I'm in my bedroom. What about you? Oh, right, okay. We are in fortunate times, friends. One of the best times to be a Half-Life fan, because even in the worst case scenario, we have a lot to talk about, which has essentially become the true character of this fandom over the years. And we got Alex. The franchise is more alive than it's been in a long, long time. Best case scenario, new games are coming. The the Half-Life community will reach new heights. We'll learn even more about our beloved universe. And thanks to Epistle 3, we know what not to expect. If you're like me, you probably think of Epistle 3 not as a piece of work, but as an event. Not a sad story of what could have been, but in many ways a celebration of the series. Was it a little bit misguided? Well, of course, but the brief insight into the mind of a man whose work has inspired us all, with a happy ending, well, that's not really so bad, is it? Now, I made this video in response to some questions I'd seen online far too recently, I think. Really? The information's there if you want it, but I think it's time for us to just close the book.